2 weeks ago, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my wife, Katya, and we were talking about what I was going to talk about today. We have an 11-year-old son. His name is Lincoln. He was sitting at the same table doing his math homework. And during a pause in my conversation with Katya, I looked over at Lincoln, and I was suddenly thunderstruck by a recollection of a client of mine. My client was a guy named Will. He was from North Texas. He never knew his father very well because his father left his mom while she was pregnant with him. And so he was destined to be raised by a single mom, which might have been all right, except that this particular single mom was a paranoid schizophrenic. And when Will was 5 years old, she tried to kill him with a butcher knife. And I realized that when my client Will was his age, he'd been living by himself for 2 years. Will eventually joined a gang and committed a number of very serious crimes, including, most seriously of all, a horrible, tragic murder. And Will was ultimately executed as punishment for that crime. I want to spend a couple of minutes telling you how a death penalty case unfolds, and then I want to tell you 2 lessons that I have learned over the last 20 years as a death penalty lawyer from watching well more than 100 cases unfold in this way. You can think of a death penalty case as a story that has 4 chapters. The first chapter of every case is exactly the same, and it is tragic. It begins with the murder of an innocent human being, and it's followed by a trial where the murderer is convicted and sent to death row, and that death sentence is ultimately upheld by the state appellate court. The second chapter consists of a complicated legal proceeding known as a state habeas corpus appeal. The third chapter is an even more complicated legal proceeding known as a federal habeas corpus proceeding. And the fourth chapter is one where a variety of things can happen. The lawyers might file a clemency petition, they might initiate even more complex litigation, or they might not do anything at all. But that fourth chapter always ends with an execution. Juries have started to sentence more and more people to prison for the rest of their lives without the possibility of parole, rather than sending them to the execution chamber. Why has that happened? It hasn't happened because of a dissolution of popular support for the death penalty. Death penalty opponents take great solace in the fact that death penalty support in Texas is at an all-time low. Do you know what all-time low in Texas means? It means that it's in the low 60%. Now that's really good compared to the mid-1980s when it was in excess of 80%. But we can't explain the decline in death sentences and the affinity for life without the possibility of parole by an erosion of support for the death penalty, because people still support the death penalty. What's happened to cause this phenomenon? What's happened is that lawyers who represent death row inmates have shifted their focus to earlier and earlier chapters of the death penalty story. So 25 years ago, they focused on Chapter 4, and they went from Chapter 4 25 years ago to Chapter 3 in the late 1980s. And they went from Chapter 3 in the late 1980s to Chapter 2 in the mid-1990s. And beginning in the mid to late 1990s, they began to focus on Chapter 1 of the story. Now, you might think that this decline in death sentences and the increase in the number of life sentences is a good thing or a bad thing. I don't want to have a conversation about that today. All that I want to tell you is that the reason that this has happened is because death penalty lawyers have understood that the earlier you intervene in a case, the greater the likelihood that you're going to save your client's life. 80% of the people on death row are people who came from the same sort of dysfunctional family that Will did. 80% of the people on death row are people who had exposure to the juvenile justice system. That's the second lesson that I've learned. When you have a big old gnarly problem, sometimes the solution is to slice it into smaller problems. That's what we do for most problems. In math and physics, even in social policy, we slice them into smaller, more manageable problems. But every once in a while, as Dwight Eisenhower said, the way you solve a problem is to make it bigger. Okay. The way we solve this problem is to make the issue of the death penalty bigger. We have to say, all right, we have these 4 chapters of a death penalty story, but what happens before that story begins? How can we intervene in the life of a murderer before he's a murderer? My client Will, and 80% of the people on death row, had 5 chapters in their lives that came before the 4 chapters of the death penalty story. I think of these 5 chapters as points of intervention, places in their lives when our society could have intervened in their lives and nudged them off of the path that they were on that created a consequence that we all, death penalty supporters or death penalty opponents, say was a bad result. Now, during each of these 5 chapters, when his mother was pregnant with him, in his early childhood years, when he was in elementary school, when he was middle school and then high school, and when he was in the juvenile justice system, during each of those 5 chapters, there were a wide variety of things that society could have done. In fact, if we just imagine that there are 5 different modes of intervention, the way that society could intervene, in each of those 5 chapters, and we could mix and match them any way we want, there are 3,000, more than 3,000 possible strategies that we could embrace in order to nudge kids like Will off of the path that they're on. We could be providing early childhood care for economically disadvantaged and otherwise troubled kids. And we could be doing it for free. And we could be nudging kids like Will off of the path that we're on. We could be providing special schools at both the high school level and the middle school level, but even in K through 5, that target economically and otherwise disadvantaged kids, and particularly kids who have had exposure to the juvenile justice system. There's one other thing we can be doing. Well, there are a bunch of other things we can be doing. There's one other thing that we could be doing that I'm going to mention, and this is going to be the only controversial thing that I say today. We could be intervening much more aggressively into dangerously dysfunctional homes and getting kids out of them before their moms pick up butcher knives and threaten to kill them. If we're going to do that, we need a place to put them. Even if we do all of those things, some kids are going to fall through the cracks and they're going to end up in that last chapter before the murder story begins. They're going to end up in the juvenile justice system. And even if that happens, it's not yet too late. There's still time to nudge them if we think about nudging them rather than just punishing them. There are 2 professors in the Northeast, one at Yale and one at Maryland. They set up a school that is attached to a juvenile prison. And the kids are in prison, but they go to school from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Now, it was logistically difficult. They had to recruit teachers who wanted to teach inside a prison. They had to establish strict separation between the people who work at the school and the prison authorities. And most dauntingly of all, they needed to invent a new curriculum because you know what? People don't come into and out of prison on a semester basis. But they did all those things. Now, what do all of these things have in common? What all of these things have in common is that they cost money. Some of the people in the room might be old enough to remember the guy on the old oil filter commercial. He used to say, well, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. What we're doing in the death penalty system is we're paying later. But the thing is that for every $15,000 that we spend intervening in the lives of economically and otherwise disadvantaged kids in those earlier chapters, we save $80,000 in crime-related costs down the road. Even if you don't agree that there's a moral imperative that we do it, it just makes economic sense. In between the time you arrived here this morning and the time we break for lunch, there are going to be 4 homicides in the United States. We're going to devote enormous social resources to punishing the people who commit those crimes, and that's appropriate because we should punish people who do bad things. But 3 of those crimes are preventable. If we make the picture bigger and devote our attention to the earlier chapters, then we're never going to write the first sentence that begins the death penalty story. Thank you.